The small town of Meadow Creek basked in its morning stillness. The streets, lined with neat rows of houses, stood quiet, save for the occasional chirping of birds and the low hum of cars passing by. It was a place that seemed frozen in time, peaceful and predictable. But under the surface of its idyllic charm, tensions brewed in whispers and unspoken glances. In a modest corner house, Marvin Walker sat on his porch, sipping a steaming cup of coffee. At 46 years old, Marvin had a commanding presence, broad shoulders, a barreled chest, and hands calloused from years of physical training. His skin gleamed like polished mahogany under the morning sun, and his thick beard framed a face that carried a quiet wisdom. To anyone passing by, he was just the friendly neighbor who waved and offered a kind word. Few knew the life Marvin had lived before settling in Meadow Creek. Marvin had been an MMA champion, renowned for his explosive power and near-perfect technique. He had earned respect in the ring and fear from his opponents. But after a tragic accident claimed his wife and young daughter 5 years ago, Marvin disappeared from the public eye. Seeking solace, he retired to this quiet town, hoping to rebuild a life far from the chaos of fame and violence. As Marvin sipped his coffee, he watched the world go by. A few kids rode their bikes down the street, laughing and calling to one another. An elderly couple walked their dog, sharing quiet conversation. Marvin found peace in these simple moments, but deep down, he carried a weight he couldn't shake, a gnawing sense of emptiness. He set his mug down and glanced at his watch. It was almost time for his morning run. Pulling on a faded hoodie and a pair of sneakers, he stepped off the porch and began jogging down the familiar path. The crisp air filled his lungs, and his feet struck the pavement in a steady rhythm. This was his therapy, his way of finding balance. As Marvin rounded the corner into a small park, he noticed a group of teenagers clustered near the swings. They were loud, their laughter tinged with an edge of cruelty. A younger boy stood apart from them, clutching his backpack tightly. Marvin slowed his pace, his instincts kicking in. "Hey, freak, where do you think you're going?" One of the teens sneered, stepping closer to the boy. Marvin stopped, watching the scene unfold. The boy, no older than 13, looked terrified. His lip quivered as he stammered, I'm just going home." The leader of the group, a lanky kid with a mop of greasy hair, shoved the boy's shoulder. "Not so fast. You got to pay the toll, loser." Marvin's jaw tightened. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to stay calm. Violence wasn't the answer, not here, not now. But as the bullies advanced on the boy, something primal stirred within him. "Is there a problem here?" Marvin's deep voice cut through the air like a blade. The group turned, startled by his presence. The leader sneered, trying to mask his fear. "Mind your business, old man." Marvin stepped closer, his gaze steady and unyielding. "I think you should leave him alone." The bully hesitated, then scoffed. "Whatever. Let's go, guys." With a final shove to the younger boy, they slinked away, muttering under their breath. Marvin knelt beside the boy, who looked up at him with wide, grateful eyes. "You okay, kid?" The boy nodded, wiping his tears. "Yeah, thanks. What's your name?" "Jamal," he whispered. "All right, Jamal. Next time, stand tall." "Don't let them see you're scared," Marvin said gently. Jamal nodded, a flicker of confidence returning. "I'll try." As Marvin watched Jamal walk away, he couldn't shake the memory of his own childhood. Growing up as a black kid in a rough neighborhood, he had faced his share of bullies. It was one of the reasons he'd taken up fighting in the first place, to protect himself and those who couldn't fight back. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumble of a truck engine. He turned to see a rusty pickup barreling down the street, its passengers leaning out the windows. They wore smirks and shouted slurs that cut through the air like shards of glass. Marvin's chest tightened. He'd seen these men around town. A group of locals known for causing trouble, especially for people who looked like him. The truck slowed as it passed, and one of the men shouted, "Go back to where you came from." They erupted in laughter as they sped away. Marvin clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered their hate, and he doubted it would be the last. But Marvin had promised himself he wouldn't resort to violence unless absolutely necessary. As he jogged home, he couldn't help but feel a storm brewing. The peace he had sought in Meadow Creek was starting to feel like an illusion. And for the first time in years, Marvin wondered if it was only a matter of time before his past collided with his present. The sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across Meadow Creek. Marvin sat in his small living room, flipping through an old photo album. Images of his wife, Alicia, and their daughter, Mia, stared back at him, bright smiles frozen in time. He traced his finger over their faces, a bittersweet smile tugging at his lips. The peace he'd sought in this town had given him moments like this, quiet reflections on the life he once had. But the events of the morning weighed heavily on his mind. The encounter with the bullies and the passing truck had stirred something inside him. He felt the familiar itch of his old instincts, the urge to step in, to protect, to fight. But Marvin knew all too well the cost of giving in to that side of himself. He sighed and closed the album, placing it carefully back on the shelf. As he stood, a knock at the door startled him. Marvin opened it to find Jermel standing on his porch, clutching a skateboard. "Hey, Mr. Walker," Jermel said, his voice timid but hopeful. "Jamal, everything all right?" Marvin asked, stepping aside to let him in. Jamal nodded. "Yeah, I wanted to say thanks again. And I was wondering if maybe you could teach me some stuff. Like how to stand up for myself." Marvin raised an eyebrow, studying the boy. "What kind of stuff?" "You know, how to fight," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. Marvin's chest tightened. He knew the dangers of teaching someone so young to fight, how it could become a weapon rather than a shield. But he also saw the determination in Jamal's eyes, the same determination Marvin had as a kid. "I'll tell you what," Marvin said after a moment. "I'll teach you how to defend yourself. But fighting should always be your last resort." "Deal?" Jamal's face lit up. "Deal." Over the next week, Marvin and Jamal began meeting at the park. Marvin taught him the basics: how to keep his balance, how to throw a proper punch, and most importantly, how to stay calm under pressure. Jamal was a quick learner, and Marvin found himself growing fond of the boy. In him, Marvin saw a glimmer of the future, a chance to pass on lessons he'd learned the hard way. But as their sessions continued, the town's undercurrent of hostility grew more apparent. One evening, as Marvin and Jamal practiced footwork near the basketball court, the rumble of a familiar truck filled the air. Marvin stiffened as the rusty pickup pulled up nearby. The same group of men from before. Pete, the ringleader, and his lackeys climbed out, their beer cans in hand. "Well, look who it is," Pete drawled, his voice dripping with mockery. The big man teaching the kids some moves. Jamal froze, his eyes darting to Marvin. Marvin stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his eyes sharp. "Evening, Pete. Something I can help you with." Pete smirked, taking a swig of his beer. "Just admiring the view. Didn't know you were running a gym out here." "Just helping the kid out," Marvin said evenly. Pete's smirk widened. "You think that's going to help him?" "Teaching him how to punch. Some people around here don't take kindly to outsiders." Marvin's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We're all just trying to live our lives, Pete. Why don't you let us do that?" Pete took a step closer, his tone turning colder. "You don't belong here, Walker. You never did. Sooner or later, you're going to figure that out." The tension was thick, but Marvin refused to rise to the bait. He simply stared at Pete, his silence more intimidating than any words. Finally, Pete snorted and backed off, gesturing for his men to follow. As the truck rolled away, Jamal looked up at Marvin, his voice trembling. "Are they going to come back?" Marvin placed a reassuring hand on the boy's shoulder. "Don't worry about them. I'll handle it." But Marvin couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. Pete and his gang weren't just a nuisance. They were a threat. And Marvin knew they wouldn't stop until they made their point. The next day, Marvin visited the local diner, a cozy spot where the town's gossip flowed freely. As he sipped his coffee, he overheard two women at the counter discussing a recent string of vandalism. They hit the Jones place last night. One of them whispered, spray-painted slurs all over their fence. Marvin's grip on his mug tightened. The Jones family, a young black couple who had moved to Meadow Creek a few months ago, had already faced their share of harassment. "It's that Dan Pete and his crew," the other woman muttered. "But no one's brave enough to do anything about it." Marvin finished his coffee and left, his mind racing. He couldn't stand by and let this continue. But confronting Pete directly would only escalate things. He needed a plan. That night, Marvin sat in his living room, his laptop open on the coffee table. He scrolled through local news articles, looking for any mention of Pete's activities. It didn't take long to find a pattern: vandalism, intimidation, and assaults, all targeting people of color or newcomers to the town. As Marvin dove deeper, he stumbled upon an article about a man named Charlie Dawson, a former police officer who had tried to expose Pete's gang years ago. The article mentioned that Charlie had retired after facing threats against his family. The name rang a bell. Marvin remembered seeing an older man sitting alone at the park, feeding the ducks. If anyone knew how to deal with Pete, it might be him. The next morning, Marvin found Charlie at the park as expected. The man was wiry and weathered, his face etched with lines of experience. "Mind if I join you?" Marvin asked, gesturing to the bench. Charlie glanced up and shrugged. "Suit yourself." They sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the pond. Finally, Marvin spoke. "I've been hearing about Pete and his crew. Seems like they've been at this for a long time." Charlie chuckled bitterly. "That's putting it lightly. They've run this town for years, and no one's done a damn thing to stop them." "Why not?" Charlie turned to him, his eyes hard. "Because they're cowards. They pick their targets carefully. People who can't fight back, who don't have the resources to stand up to them. And when someone does try, they make sure to shut them down." Marvin nodded, his mind racing. What if someone could stand up to them? Someone who's not afraid? Charlie studied him for a long moment, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You've got guts, Walker. But you better be ready for what comes next. Those boys don't play fair." "I face worse," Marvin said simply. Charlie's smile faded. "Then you'd better watch your back. Because once you go after Pete, there's no going back." As Marvin walked home, he felt the weight of Charlie's warning. He knew he was stepping onto dangerous ground. But he couldn't sit by and let Pete and his gang terrorize the town. That night, as Marvin prepared for bed, he heard the faint sound of glass shattering outside. His heart raced as he grabbed a flashlight and stepped onto his porch. His truck's windshield was smashed, and the word **leave** was spray-painted in red across the hood. Marvin stood in the cold night air, his fists clenched. He had tried to avoid conflict, to live a quiet life. But Pete had made it clear this wasn't over. And Marvin was done running. The shattered glass from Marvin's truck glistened under the streetlights, reflecting the crimson smear of the word **leave** that had been hastily sprayed across his windshield. The cold air cut through his thin shirt, but it wasn't the chill that made his spine stiffen. It was the weight of realization. The storm he had been trying to avoid had finally hit. Marvin stood frozen, staring at the damage. The world around him seemed distant, muted, as if the echo of his breath was the only sound in the night. His fists clenched tighter, his nails biting into his palms. He knew what this meant. This wasn't just a prank. Pete and his gang had crossed the line, and they weren't backing down. A car door slammed behind him, pulling Marvin from his thoughts. He turned to see Jamal standing in his driveway, eyes wide, face pale. "Mr. Walker," Jamal's voice trembled. "I saw them. I saw the guys, Pete and his crew. They were." Before Jamal could finish, the low growl of a truck engine rumbled in the distance. Marvin's gaze snapped to the road, where headlights appeared, growing larger and more menacing. His instincts flared. "Get inside, Jamal," Marvin said, his voice low and urgent. Jamal hesitated, his eyes darting to Marvin's truck, then back to the approaching vehicle. "Are they?" "Inside. Now." Marvin's tone left no room for argument. Jamal nodded, quickly backing away toward the porch as Marvin stepped into the shadows. The truck came into view, a familiar, rusted pickup that screeched to a halt at the end of his driveway. The engine shut off with a grating cough. The door opened, and Pete emerged, flanked by two of his lackeys. The moonlight revealed their sneers, and the sharp glint of knives tucked into their waistbands. Marvin's muscles tensed, his gaze never leaving Pete as the man slowly approached. "You didn't get the message, did you?" Pete said, his voice dripping with venom. Marvin didn't answer, standing his ground as Pete and his cronies encircled him. The air felt thick with impending violence. "You've been warned," Pete continued, leaning in, his breath sour. "It's not your town, Walker. And it's not your place." Marvin exhaled slowly, his mind working to stay calm. "You want me to leave? That's not happening." Pete laughed darkly, the sound like gravel scraping on stone. "Well, then we'll make you leave, one way or another." Before Marvin could react, one of Pete's lackeys lunged, swinging a broken bottle toward his face. Marvin dodged the strike with ease, his reflexes kicking in like they had so many times in the ring. The bottle crashed against the pavement, sending shards scattering. But the moment of distraction was enough. Pete's other lackey grabbed Marvin by the arm, jerking him off balance. Marvin shoved him back, but not before a sharp pain flared in his side. A knife now buried just beneath his ribs. A cold surge of adrenaline rushed through Marvin as he staggered, his breath hitching. He pushed the pain aside, focusing on the threat before him. Pete stepped forward, eyes cold and calculating. "You're done," Pete said, his smile twisted. "This is your final warning, Marvin." Marvin took a breath, grounding himself. He had been here before, facing down enemies in dark, unforgiving places. But this time was different. Pete and his gang weren't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to break him. And if he didn't end this now, they would only escalate. In one swift motion, Marvin pulled the knife from his side, using his own blood to fuel the fire that burned inside him. His vision sharpened as the world slowed around him. The first lackey lunged again, but Marvin was already moving. He dodged the strike, sidestepping and catching the man's arm in a vicious lock. Pete's eyes widened as Marvin twisted the lackey's arm, forcing him to drop the knife. With a grunt, Marvin shoved him away, sending the man sprawling across the gravel driveway. Pete hesitated, clearly sizing up his opponent. But Marvin could see the shift in the air, the moment Pete realized that Marvin wasn't just some washed-up former fighter. He was a man who had lived through hell and come out the other side. "You want to fight, Pete?" Marvin's voice was cold and lethal. "Then let's finish it." The air crackled with tension as the two men squared off, each sizing the other up. For a brief, agonizing moment, the world around them went still. Then, like a violent storm, Pete charged, his knife flashing in the moonlight. Marvin moved with the precision of a seasoned fighter, sidestepping Pete's wild lunge and landing a brutal punch to his gut. Pete staggered back, gasping for air. But the momentary advantage was fleeting. Pete recovered quickly, his fury blinding his instincts. He lunged again, this time with a vicious slash aimed at Marvin's face. Marvin blocked the strike with his forearm, the cold steel biting into his skin. But the pain was fleeting, and Marvin twisted his body, using his momentum to drive his elbow into Pete's ribs. The blow landed with a sickening crack. Pete stumbled, his grip loosening on the knife. Seizing the opportunity, Marvin swept Pete's legs out from under him, sending the man crashing to the ground with a thud. As Pete struggled to rise, Marvin stood over him, breathing heavily, his pulse thundering in his ears. "You should have stayed out of my way," Marvin growled, his voice low and dangerous. But before Marvin could finish, he felt a sharp pull at his leg. Another lackey, now back on his feet, trying to drag him down. Marvin kicked out, knocking the man away, but the distraction was enough for Pete to scramble to his feet. "Finish him," Pete rasped, his voice filled with venom. The second lackey, now holding a crowbar, swung it toward Marvin's head. Time seemed to slow as Marvin ducked, the weapon missing by inches. He countered with a devastating elbow to the lackey's jaw, sending the man crumpling to the ground. But as Marvin looked up, his heart skipped a beat. Behind Pete, a new figure emerged from the shadows, a tall man wearing a long coat, his face obscured by a dark hat. The newcomer watched the scene with cold, detached eyes, a slow, unsettling smile spreading across his face. Marvin's senses screamed at him. This wasn't just a random thug. This man, he was someone else. Pete turned to the newcomer, his voice filled with confusion. "What the hell are you doing here?" The man took a step forward, his gaze locking with Marvin's. "I'm here to collect," he said, his voice smooth and calm, like a predator savoring its prey. Marvin's blood ran cold as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just a gang. There was something much larger at play, something deeper, darker. And the stakes had just been raised. "Who the hell are you?" Marvin demanded, his voice shaking with anger and disbelief. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver object, tossing it casually toward Pete. The object landed at Pete's feet with a soft clink, a badge. Pete looked down, his eyes widening. You're with them." The man nodded slowly, his smile never faltering. "I don't take kindly to people like you making trouble. You've been warned, Pete, and you've been dealt with." With that, the man turned, his coat swirling behind him as he walked away, leaving Pete and his crew in stunned silence. Marvin stood still, his mind racing as the true nature of the danger unfolded before him. The fight for survival had just become much more complicated, and much more deadly. Marvin watched as the stranger in the long coat disappeared into the night, his mind swirling with confusion and dread. The world felt like it had suddenly shifted beneath his feet, throwing him into deeper, murkier waters. Pete and his gang stood motionless, their collective fury simmering just below the surface, but it was the appearance of the man with the badge that had truly rattled Marvin. "You think this is over, Walker?" Pete sneered, his face flushed with anger. He was still clutching his side where Marvin had landed a solid punch, but his eyes burned with a new kind of venom. "You just made a huge mistake." Marvin didn't answer. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on Pete's, measuring his next move. It wasn't the gang that worried him now, it was the man with the badge. Pete, for all his bluster, was a small-time bully. But whoever had shown up tonight, whoever Pete feared, that was the true threat. The streetlights flickered above them, casting long shadows over the scene. Marvin's side burned with pain, but he couldn't afford to focus on it. Every second spent here was another moment Pete could regroup. "We're not done here, Walker," Pete growled, spitting on the ground before turning toward his truck. "But you'll be seeing us again soon. Count on it." With a final glare, Pete and his lackeys piled into the truck and sped off into the night, leaving Marvin standing alone in the dark. His heart pounded in his chest, and the chill of the evening air began to creep into his bones. Inside his house, Marvin cleaned the blood from his side. The pain from the knife whammed a sharp reminder that the fight wasn't over. He moved sluggishly, his mind racing as the weight of what had just transpired settled in. The stranger with the badge had brought the kind of fear that even Pete couldn't mask. And if Pete was afraid, Marvin knew he was standing on dangerous ground. He grabbed his phone and dialed Charlie's number, needing to speak to someone who might have answers. The phone rang twice before Charlie picked up. "Yeah." Charlie's voice was gruff, a trace of suspicion lingering in his tone. "Charlie, it's Marvin. Something's happening." Pete's crew, they're connected to something bigger, someone. Marvin hesitated. Someone in a long coat. A guy with a badge. A long pause followed, the line filled with a quiet, tense air. "You sure about this?" Charlie finally asked. "I'm sure," Marvin said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. This guy had a badge, Charlie. Pete was scared of him. "And I've been hearing rumors about something else in town. something darker. I need to know what's going on. Charlie exhaled sharply, his voice lower now, almost a whisper. Get to my place. I'll explain everything. But Marvin, be careful. This is bigger than you think. Marvin didn't waste another second. The drive to Charlie's house felt like an eternity. Marvin's body was still throbbing from the earlier fight. But the tension in his chest had nothing to do with physical pain. It was the knowledge that Pete's gang wasn't the real danger. That much was clear now. The man with the badge had set something into motion that Marvin wasn't ready for, and he wasn't sure if he could stop it. When he arrived at Charlie's house, the older man was waiting for him by the door, his face grave. He ushered Marvin inside without a word. Sit down, Charlie said, motioning to the table where 2 mugs of coffee waited. Marvin sank into the chair, and Charlie took the seat opposite him. I've been trying to stay out of this for years, Charlie began, rubbing his temples. But it seems like the past is catching up with all of us. Marvin narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Charlie hesitated, glancing over his shoulder as though checking for someone in the shadows. Pete's gang. They're small time. But they're working for someone much bigger. The man you saw tonight, his name's Simon Cross. He's with a group that's been running illegal operations across the state. Drugs, human trafficking, money laundering, you name it. They've been controlling Meadow Creek from the shadows for years, and Pete and his gang. They're just the muscle. Marvin sat back, disbelief sinking in. Human trafficking. It's real. And it's been going on right under our noses. Charlie's voice was hard, his eyes dark with regret. I was part of a task force that tried to shut them down years ago. But Cross and his people have connections, the kind of connections that make people disappear. Marvin clenched his fists, a surge of anger rising within him. He'd always thought of Meadow Creek as a quiet, peaceful place, far removed from the filth of the world. But now, that illusion had been shattered. So, what do we do? Marvin asked, his voice low. Charlie looked grim. We fight back. But not like you think. Simon Cross is connected to people in high places, people with power. You can't just go after him head on. Pete was just the tip of the iceberg. Marvin absorbed the weight of Charlie's words. He'd been thinking of the fight as something personal, something he could resolve by taking on Pete and his crew. But now he saw the full scope of the battle before him. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about a network of corruption and crime that reached far beyond Meadow Creek. You can't do this alone, Charlie added, his voice softer now. I've made enemies, and I've already had too many close calls. But you're a fighter. You've got what it takes. Marvin's chest tightened at the mention of his past. He had walked away from the fighting world for a reason. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some vigilant. He was just a man trying to live a quiet life. But that life was slipping away from him, piece by piece. I didn't want to be part of this, Charlie, Marvin said, his voice thick with emotion. I just wanted to be left alone. I've made my mistakes. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. Charlie looked at him, his expression unwavering. You already are. As Marvin left Charlie's house, a heavy sense of unease settled over him. The quiet, peaceful life he had wanted was slipping further and further from his grasp, and he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. The decision to take on Simon Cross, to expose the darkness beneath Meadow Creek, had consequences. But it wasn't just the danger that haunted him. It was the growing sense of betrayal. When he arrived home, he found Jamal waiting on his porch, his skateboard resting by his feet. The boy looked up, a hesitant smile on his face. You okay, Mr. Walker? Jamal asked. Marvin hesitated, feeling the weight of the lies he had yet to tell. He knew Jamal was looking up to him, hoping he could protect him from the violence that was creeping closer. But how could he promise that when Marvin wasn't even sure if he could protect himself? Marvin put a hand on Jamal's shoulder, his voice quiet. It's going to be all right. I'll take care of it. Just stay out of trouble. Jamal nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes that Marvin couldn't ignore. The kid wasn't as naive as he once seemed, and Marvin knew that sooner or later The danger would touch everyone in his life. As Marvin closed the door behind him, his thoughts spiraled. The fight was no longer just about Pete's gown. It was about a system, a network that ran deep. And the more Marvin uncovered, the more dangerous it became. His victory tonight had been hollow. The fight ahead was only just beginning. The deeper he dug, the more he realized. The truth had its own price. The day had finally come. Marvin stood in the small, dimly lit office of Charlie's old friend, Jack Hollis, a former investigator who had left the force years ago. The walls around them were cluttered with photos, maps, and strings connecting dots in a web of criminal activity. The weight of the truth was pressing down on Marvin's chest. Simon Cross, the man behind the veil of chaos that had infected Meadow Creek, was closing in, and Marvin could no longer afford to hide. "Everything we've found leads to this," Jack said, his voice hoarse from years of silence. He dropped the folder on the table before Marvin, his eyes grave. "This is where Cross operates out of, an old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. We've been tracking his shipments for weeks, but we never had enough to act." Marvin looked at the map, his finger tracing the lines that marked the routes the trucks had taken, where the shipments were hidden. He felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. He knew now that he wasn't fighting some faceless criminal group. Cross was a cancer, and Meadow Creek had been his breeding ground. His web of control reached into the very fabric of the town, corrupting everything it touched. "I'm not waiting for another lead," Marvin said, his voice steady and sharp. "Tonight, we end this." Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the folder. "You can't do it alone. Cross's people will be armed, and they're not afraid to kill. You need backup, Marvin. I know people who can help." But Marvin shook his head, determination hardening in his eyes. "I've already waited too long. If I'm going in, I go in alone. No one else is getting hurt because of me." Jack watched him for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. He understood what Marvin meant. This wasn't just a fight against Cross. It was a fight against everything that had stolen his peace, his quiet life. And for that, Marvin would face it head-on. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over Meadow Creek, Marvin was already en route to the warehouse. His truck rattled over the uneven road, each bump a reminder of how close he was to the final confrontation. His side still ached from the wound Pete's lackey had given him, but the pain felt distant now. All that mattered was the mission ahead. As he neared the warehouse, Marvin's nerves tingled with a sense of dread. The place looked abandoned, an eerie silence hanging in the air. The windows were shattered, and the rusted metal doors creaked ominously in the wind. But he knew the truth. This was no forgotten building. It was a fortress of darkness, a stronghold for Cross and his people. Marvin parked his truck a few hundred yards away, carefully approaching the perimeter. He moved swiftly, his body low to the ground, the shadows his ally. His heart pounded, but his mind was focused, clear. The weight of his decisions, of everything that had led him here, pressed on him. But there was no turning back now. He reached the back of the warehouse, where a single door hung crookedly on its hinges. Marvin pushed it open slowly, the creak of the door echoing in the stillness. Inside, the warehouse was a cavernous, dimly lit space filled with crates and metal structures that cast long, distorted shadows. The air smelled of oil, rust, and something worse, the stench of desperation and fear. He moved silently through the space, his senses on high alert. Every step, every sound, felt magnified in the silence of the warehouse. He could hear faint murmurs, voices coming from deeper inside. His pulse quickened. They were here, Cross's men. And soon, they'd know he was here too. Inside the heart of the warehouse, Simon Cross stood in front of a map, studying the various locations they controlled. His face was impassive, but his eyes gleamed with the cold precision of a man who had risen from nothing to control everything. "They'll come for us," one of his men, a hulking figure named Garcia, muttered from the shadows. "Walker won't back down. We've pushed him too far." Cross didn't turn, his voice low but commanding. "Walker's a stubborn fool. He'll come. And when he does, we'll be ready. Garcia nodded, a smile stretching across his face. He didn't fear Marvin. He respected the man's strength, but he didn't fear him. In the end, they had the upper hand. But as he spoke, a sharp sound cut through the air, like the crack of a twig snapping underfoot. Marvin had found his way inside. The room fell silent. Cross's men shifted nervously, but Cross remained unfazed. He turned slowly to face Garcia, a faint smirk pulling at the corners of his lips. Let him come. We've been waiting for this. Marvin's heart beat in his ears as he moved deeper into the warehouse. Every corner he turned, every sound that echoed through the space, made him more aware of the danger closing in around him. He knew the risks, but there was no time for second thoughts. He rounded a corner and froze. Ahead he saw a figure emerge from the shadows, Simon Cross. The man stood tall and imposing, his presence filling the space with a dark gravity. His suit was impeccable, his gaze sharp and calculating. And though he stood alone, Marvin knew better than to underestimate him. You must be Marvin Walker, Cross said, his voice smooth, almost conversational. I've heard a lot about you. The old champion turned into a quiet man. How disappointing. Marvin's fists clenched. I didn't come here for small talk, Cross. Cross smiled, a cold, mocking gesture. Of course you didn't. You came for revenge. But revenge won't bring your peace back, Marvin. It won't fix what's been broken. Broken. Marvin's voice was low, dangerous. You've been running this town for years, tearing everything apart, and you call it broken. You've infected this place, Cross. You've hurt people who had nothing to do with your game. Cross's smile faded, but his eyes gleamed with something darker. I don't need to explain myself to you. You think you can stop me. You think you can take me down. Marvin stepped forward, his body tense, every muscle coiled like a spring. I don't need to stop you, Cross. I just need to put an end to what you've done. With a flick of his wrist, Cross signaled to the shadows. And like a wave crashing against the shore, his men emerged from every corner, surrounding Marvin in a tight circle. Garcia, the hulking figure, stepped forward, a knife gleaming in his hand. You're outnumbered, Walker, Garcia taunted, his smile wide and cruel. You should have stayed in hiding. But Marvin's response came in a blur of motion. He ducked under Garcia's strike, his fists connecting with the man's ribs with bone-shattering force. Garcia staggered back, but before Marvin could capitalize on the opening, a sharp pain exploded in his side. Another knife, another wound. He gritted his teeth, refusing to let the pain stop him. His body moved on instinct, his training kicking in. He swept his leg out, knocking one of Cross's men to the ground, then spun, throwing a brutal punch to another's jaw. But Cross watched, his eyes narrowed in approval, and for the first time, Marvin felt the weight of the man's gaze. It was more than just physical power that Cross wielded. It was control, manipulation. And Marvin was starting to realize that fighting Cross's men was just the beginning. The real battle was the war inside, against everything Cross had built, against the darkness that had taken root in his own soul. As Cross stepped forward, his calm demeanor was unsettling. You think you're a hero, Marvin? He asked, his voice low. You're nothing more than a pawn, just like the rest of them. I own this town. I control everything. And you? Cross smiled. You're just a fleeting shadow in my game. Marvin's vision blurred from the pain, but the fire inside him only burned brighter. He wasn't here to be anyone's pawn. He was here to make sure that Cross's game ended tonight. The final confrontation had begun. The warehouse was chaotic, a symphony of violence and desperation. Marvin's body screamed for relief, but his resolve was steel. Unyielding, unbreakable. Blood ran down his side, where the knife wound pulsed with pain, but he kept fighting. He wasn't just fighting Cross's men. He was fighting for his past, for the peace that had been stolen from him, and for every soul who had suffered under Cross's grip. Garcia lunged at him again, but Marvin sidestepped, his foot sweeping across the floor as he struck the giant's knee, sending him crashing to the ground. It was brutal and quick, and Marvin's knuckles were bruised, swollen from the constant impact. He could feel the presence of Cross lingering just out of reach, but Marvin couldn't stop. Not yet. "Is this all you have?" Marvin shouted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Is this the best you can do?" Cross stood at the periphery, calmly watching, almost amused by the carnage unfolding in front of him. His men were falling. "You've got spirit, Marvin," one by one, Cross said. His Marvin didn't seem to care about the damage, but it's futile. All he cared about was ending this. "Every empire falls eventually, but mine is invincible." He tilted his head, studying Marvin. "You've got heart, but no brains. You don't understand the game you're in." "Maybe I don't," Marvin gasped, spinning to land a punch to the face of one of Cross's men. "But I understand you're not walking out of here." It wasn't long before Marvin had reduced Cross's men to nothing but a scattered group of groaning bodies on the ground. The warehouse echoed with their groans of defeat, but Cross remained unfazed. There was something unsettling about his calm, something that gnawed at Marvin's insides. He turned his full attention to Cross. "Now it's just you and me." Cross smiled, the edges of his mouth curling in a slow, deliberate motion. "You think you can take me on? I'm untouchable. You'll never win, Walker. I always stay 2 steps ahead. Look at what you've done. You've eliminated a few pawns, but the real power still rests with me. With my connections, you can't even imagine the influence I wield." "You've had your time," Marvin said through gritted teeth, his fists clenched at his sides. His heart was pounding, but this time it wasn't from exhaustion or pain. It was from something else, something colder. "Your time's up, Cross." Suddenly, Cross's hand darted out, and the cold gleam of a gun appeared in his palm. "You think I've been sitting idle while you beat up my men?" Cross's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "I've been waiting for this moment, Marvin. Waiting for the last fool to think they can stop me." But Marvin didn't flinch. He stepped forward, his gaze locked on Cross's. "You'll have to shoot me to stop me." Cross's finger twitched on the trigger, but before he could pull it, Marvin lunged. In a blur of motion, he knocked the gun out of Cross's hand, sending it skittering across the concrete floor. With a low growl of frustration, Cross dove toward it, but Marvin was faster. He spun and kicked the gun into the corner of the room, trapping it out of reach. This time, there was no running, no retreat. It was just the two of them, man to man. Cross glared at him, his eyes filled with contempt. "You're a fool. I've built an empire, Marvin. You can't bring it down with your fists." Marvin didn't speak. He lunged again, his fist crashing into Cross's jaw, but the man was faster than he'd anticipated. Cross ducked and countered, sending a fist into Marvin's ribs. The impact was enough to send him staggering back, but Marvin steadied himself, ignoring the searing pain. "You're nothing," Cross spat. "Nothing compared to me." "You don't get it, did you?" Marvin growled, stepping forward once more. "You might be untouchable, but you're not invincible. There's always someone who'll take you down." Marvin's fist connected with Cross's stomach, knocking the wind out of him. Cross stumbled, and Marvin followed through with a brutal knee to the chest. This time, Cross didn't recover so easily. He crumpled to the ground, gasping for air. But even as Cross lay there, Marvin knew the fight wasn't over. The damage had been done. The town was waking up to the truth of what had been happening behind closed doors. Cross's empire was crumbling, but it wouldn't disappear overnight. The police arrived shortly after, responding to the call Charlie had made earlier. Officers flooded the warehouse, taking Cross and his men into custody. It didn't take long for the news to spread through Meadow Creek. Simon Cross, the man who had manipulated the town for years, was finally going to pay for his crimes. Marvin stood outside the warehouse, his body battered and bruised, watching as the authorities loaded Cross and his crew into the back of police cars. But despite the sense of victory, there was something bittersweet in the air. The battle was won, but Marvin knew that the scars left by Cross's reign would take much longer to heal. Charlie arrived at the scene, his face creased with concern but relieved. He approached Marvin, clapping him on the shoulder. "You did it," he said, his voice full of admiration. "You actually did it." Marvin looked up, his expression weary. "It's over for Cross, but it's just beginning for the town. There's a lot of work left to do." Charlie nodded, his eyes distant. "I know, but we'll get there. We'll rebuild." Marvin didn't say anything. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure. The fight wasn't over, not entirely. There were still cracks in the town that needed mending, still secrets buried beneath the surface. But now, at least, the people of Meadow Creek had a chance at peace. Weeks passed, and things in Meadow Creek began to change. The once quiet town that had lived in the shadow of Cross's criminal empire was slowly starting to reclaim its dignity. The streets were safer, the people less afraid to speak out against injustices they had endured. The weight of Cross influence was still fresh in their minds, but with every small victory, they began to rebuild their lives. Marvin's own life had changed too. He hadn't returned to the MMA circuit. That part of his life was behind him now. But he had found something more important, a sense of purpose. He wasn't a fighter anymore, not in the ring, at least. He was a protector, a guardian of the town he had grown up in. But as he stood on the porch of his house one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marvin knew that his journey was far from over. The ghosts of the past would always linger, and there were still people out there who would test his resolve. But for now he could rest. The streets of Meadow Creek were quiet again, and for the first time in a long time, Marvin felt like he could finally breathe. But even as peace settled over the town, a shadow remained, an unseen threat that lingered at the edge of the story. Cross was down, but his influence had never been just about power. It was about control, and as Marvin soon learned, when you pull down one empire, there's always someone waiting to take its place. The phone rang late one night. It was a number Marvin didn't recognize, but he answered it anyway. "Marvin Walker," the voice on the other end asked, cold and calculated. "Who's this?" Marvin replied, his pulse quickening. "You don't know me, but I know you, and I know what you've done to Cross. But I'm afraid you've only made things interesting." Before Marvin could respond, the line went dead. A chill ran down his spine. The war wasn't over. Not yet.